The NBA playoffs are here, and so is the Athletic NBA Daily. Need a fresh, fun take on last night's action? We've got every dunk, buzzer beater, and game-changing play covered. Join Dave DeFore, Zena Queta, and Esperahini Monday through Friday for fast recaps. And join me and Alex Spears Saturdays for Saturday Slam and Jam with playoff trivia and some big-time vibes. All the playoff intel you need, faster than your morning coffee. Listen on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you pod, we're there.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome back to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Richard Williams and I'm joined as ever by Matt Bishop. And Matt, I've been excited about this episode for a while because it's about one of my favourites.
One of your favourites, yes, and one of mine too, actually. That's right. In this episode, we'll be looking at the life and career of the great Jim Clark. And we'll be asking in particular whether he's not only the greatest, but also the quickest driver ever to have lived. That's rather a bold claim, I know, and of course it's impossible to prove. But over the course of this episode, we hope we'll lift the lid, especially for those less familiar with Clark, younger listeners perhaps, on what made him such a rare and special talent.
Indeed we will. And I'd like to start, if you'll indulge me, with a bit of personal recollection.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. I first saw Jim Clark on Easter Monday in 1959 at Mallory Park in Leicestershire. He was 23 years old and he'd come down to the meeting from Scotland, a complete unknown outside the world of club racing. I was 12 and it was my first motor race. My dad had decided to take us for a bank holiday family outing. My mum, my sister and me. Mallory was only about 25 miles from where we lived, over the border in Nottinghamshire, and he drove us there in his blue 1936 Rover 14 Sportsman's Saloon. A lovely car.
Absolutely lovely car.
Yep. Mallory was actually a former pony trotting track, but it was opened for motorsport in 1956. It was only 1.25 miles long, but it had some very interesting and quite challenging features. I was already extremely interested in cars and racing. My hero at the time was Stirling Moss, of course, and so to a degree was my dad. His dream car was an Aston Martin DB3, not the sort of thing he was ever likely to afford on the income of a country parson, which is what he was.
More's the pity.
All the country parsons should have Aston Martins.
More's the pity he couldn't afford it, not more's the pity that he was a country parson.
Clarified.
Yes.
Anyway, the key thing about that particular Easter Monday meeting was that the unknown young Scot won 4 races, 3 in a Lister Jaguar and 1 in a Lotus Elite. They were 2 very different cars, of course, a big, brutal sports car with a 3.4-litre engine and a nimble, lightweight 1200cc coupe. Jim won the production car race in the Elite, and the other 3 wins came in the Lister. One was in a race for big sports cars, and then there was a heat and the final of the Formula Libre event, in which anyone could enter anything. And he found himself racing against old Formula One Connaughts, new Formula 2 Coopers, a Jaguar D-Type, an Aston DB3S, and a few Lotus 11 sports cars. Imagine what that field would cost you now if you were to try and buy it.
Extraordinary.
Anyway, he was totally dominant all day, and it was extremely thrilling to watch him, in particular, chucking the Lister through Devil's Elbow, which is a tricky downhill section of the circuit between the hairpin and the finishing straight. My dad bought a program, and he and I filled in all the results. I've still got it, actually, and I'm waving it at you now.
I see it.
And I remember telling my dad that night, with all the absolute certainty a 12-year-old can muster, that Jim Clark, although we'd never heard of him, would be world champion one day.
Those are absolutely wonderful memories, Richard, and very prescient of you to pick out Jim Clark so early.
Always did have an eye for talent.
Yes, there you are. And I envy you being there that day. I mean, golden memories.
Yep.
Anyway, those golden memories of yours remind me of a formative Jim Clark experience for my friend Peter Windsor, whose name regular listeners might recognise from our last episode about Williams's 1986 season. and Frank Williams's accident. Anyway, in 1986, the year of that accident, Peter was the Williams Formula One team's comms and PR man, but he was and is also a journalist, a very fine one, actually, and he's probably the biggest Jim Clark fan there's ever been. Peter is an Englishman, born in England in 1952. Sorry, Peter, but it's true. But his family emigrated to Australia when he was very young. About 4 years old. The Windsors lived in Sydney, and Peter's father took him to watch motor racing at Warwick Farm a few times. Warwick Farm is in Sydney's southwestern suburbs. And in 1965, 12-year-old Peter saw Jim Clark win a Tasman Series race there in a Lotus 32B. If you ask Peter about that race now, he can speak for an hour about it, or more, without notes, and if you were to transcribe what he'd said, what you'd end up with would be an accurate, comprehensive and lyrical race report. Peter remembers everything about Clark, absolutely everything.
It's funny, isn't it? Nice coincidence that although Peter and I first saw Clark in different years, we were both 12 years old at the time when we were absolutely captivated.
Isn't that interesting? Yes.
Impressionable age.
He should be doing this podcast instead of me, really. Anyway, then in early 1967, when Peter was 14, he went to Kingsford Smith Airport in Sydney to watch Clark's plane take off and begin its flight back to the UK after the last race of that year's Tasman Series. And after the passengers had all boarded, Peter hung around, watching the plane out of the window. Soon, to his surprise, he saw it stop taxiing away, then begin to taxi back to the gate. He waited, and sure enough, after a while, the passengers began to walk out of the plane and back into the airport. The flight had been delayed. Peter approached Clark for an autograph nervously. Remember, he's only 14 years old. And the great man said, "Plane's been delayed, son. Come and have a cup of coffee." So Peter was thrilled, of course, and he asked Clark all sorts of questions, the kind of detailed racing questions that an avid 14-year-old fan would ask of his hero. And Peter says that Clark answered them all, patiently and attentively. And then, of course, it was time for him to reboard his flight. And Peter has worshipped Clark ever since.
Well, no wonder.
No wonder. I mean, it's a nice story. And I could tell you 100 stories about Peter's devotion to his hero. He really should write a book about him, and I hope he does. Anyway, I won't tell you 100 stories, but I will tell you 2 more very short stories about Peter and Jimmy, as he always calls him, as though he were a much-missed uncle. The first story is that I remember about 25 years ago, Peter bought himself a Porsche Boxster. He's very proud of it, very nice car, and it was pale blue. And I said to him when I saw it, "Nice colour, nice pale blue." He replied, "Powder blue. Not pale blue, powder blue. The same shade as Jimmy's Dunlop overalls at Warwick Farm in 1965. That's pure Peter. And the second story is that Peter always calls me Matty, not Matt, which no one else does. And I often wondered why. Then I worked it out. It's because Jim Clark had 4 sisters, Betty, Isabel, Susan, and Matty. And that's pure Peter too.
Sentimental old thing. Doesn't Peter actually own one of Jim's Lotus road cars?
He does. Yes, indeed, he does. He owns Clark's 1967 Lotus Elan S3 fixed head coupe, to be precise. Yellow. Absolutely lovely car.
Well, that's a proper fan for you, no question.
No question.
So I guess we should start to explain why James Clark, Jim to the outside world, and Jimmy to his friends, and Peter Windsor, inspired such a devoted following in the first place. And actually, had his parents got their way, he might never have been a famous racing driver at all. He was born in 1936 into a farming family, first in Fife, and then, when he was 4, they took over the Eddington Mains farm near Duns in Berwickshire, in the beautiful Scottish borders. 1,200 acres of land, mostly for grazing sheep and cattle.
Indeed, and young Jimmy started driving the tractor on the farm as soon as his feet could reach the pedals, at the age of 10. For 6 pence an hour, by the way. He loved it. He couldn't get enough of it.
6 old pence. That would be.
Yes,
Yeah.
2.5p.
Yeah.
It is actually. So 6 old pence an hour. A tanner, we used to call them, didn't we?
We did.
Yeah, he loved it. He couldn't get enough of it, and he was always hankering to get behind the wheel of that tractor. And it certainly wasn't for the tanner. It wasn't for the money. It was because he loved the feeling of controlling a vehicle, even at 10.
Yep. He was the youngest of 5 children and the only boy. And he was sent away to school, first to prep school in Edinburgh and then to Loretto School in Musselburgh, one of Scotland's best schools. And there, according to one of his biographers, Eric Dimmock, the days began with a cold bath and a run and ended with a Bible reading.
Not luxury.
No. He wasn't very interested in formal education, although he enjoyed sport at the school, rugby, cricket, tennis and hockey. And in the school holidays, his father took him to the local livestock sales and grain markets, on the assumption, clearly, that one day he'd take over the running of the farm, being the only boy.
Exactly.
So when he didn't show much interest in academic learning, his father took him out of school at 16 and he began working on the farm, at first as a shepherd. But, and this is a pretty decisive but, his father always had interest in cars, including a pre-war Alvis Speed 12. And Jim had started buying motoring magazines when he was still at school. And then his oldest sister's new husband turned out to have an old 3-litre Bentley of the sort that won at Le Mans in the 1920s. And sometime in the early 50s, Jim was taken down to Brands Hatch to watch his first motor race, and he remembered coming away with an autographed photo of Stirling Moss.
That's interesting. And actually, occasionally, young Jimmy used to jump into his dad's Alvis and take it for a spin around the farm. He started doing that when he was 10 years old as well, again because at last he could reach the pedals. But he could only reach the pedals by sliding forward on the seat, which meant that his head dipped below the window line. So every now and then, in order to do that, he'd have to slide back up the seat to have a look at where he was going. And neighbours were sometimes shocked to see an apparently empty Alvis running around the farm as though driven by an invisible ghost, because, of course, young Jimmy was invisible to the onlookers when he was in the slid forward to reach the pedals position.
The benefits of growing up on a farm, I think, where you can get away with that kind of thing.
Yes.
Near the farm, there was a circuit called Winfield on an old aerodrome, and it was so near that Jim could cycle over, and he used to go over to watch the Ecurie Cost team test the Jaguars that they were racing at Le Mans. And in 1953, he also went to Charterhall, another Scottish airfield circuit, to see Nino Farina, the first world champion in 1950, compete in the thin wall special Ferrari.
That's a thing to have seen, isn't it?
Certainly
Farina
is, yeah.
in a thin wall.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So he was getting hooked, not unsurprisingly, and the more so after he passed his driving test at 17, and he was given his father's Sunbeam Talbot, quite a sporty car with only 12,000 miles on the clock, which his dad had replaced with a Rover. And Jim had made friends with a local garage owner called Jock McBain, who helped him straight away as a teenager enter various local competitions like driving tests and rallies and even autocross. But he was still training as a shepherd, and his parents weren't at all keen on his racing activities. His dad was an elder in the local Presbyterian church, and he was pretty straight-laced. They'd banned him from owning a motorbike, although, of course, they didn't discourage his interest in tractors.
No.
And it was actually at a meeting of the local branch of the Young Farmers Club that he met another important figure in his career. This was a chap called Ian Scott Watson, who was involved with Jock McBain in a team called Border Reivers, Border Raiders, that means, a kind of rival to Ecurie Cos. He and Jim started competing in rallies together, but one day in 1956 they went up to an actual race meeting at Crimond in Aberdeenshire, yet another old airfield.
I should actually mention that Peter Windsor once bought an ex-Ian Scott Watson Lotus Elan as well, on the basis that Jimmy had once driven it.
Sorry, gobsmacked. Anyway, when they went up to Crimmen, they were in Scott Watson's DKW, an unusual German saloon. I don't know if you remember them, with a 3-cylinder, 2-stroke engine and front-wheel drive. They both practiced in the car, and they discovered that Jim, who'd never raced before, was 3 seconds a lap quicker.
I mean, that's a serious margin, obviously.
It sure is.
Yeah.
And he came last in the race, but that was only because he didn't want to bend his pal's car, and he was so inexperienced. But later in the year, he did win a race in it back at Winfield, and then 2 more in the Sunbeam Talbot. The following year, Scott Watson swapped the DKW for a Porsche that had belonged to the bandleader and racing driver Billy Cotton. Remember him?
Yes.
And Jim used it to take a couple more wins. When Border Reivers acquired a D-Type Jag as well as the Porsche, Jim's career really started to take off. In 1958, he took part in 42 races at 17 meetings, winning 20 of them, and people were starting to take notice.
They were, and I think we should mention a significant race here, which took place during the Boxing Day meeting at Brands Hatch in 1958, the year you were talking about, when, driving a Lotus Elite for the first time, Clark, 21 years old at the time, finished second to Lotus boss Colin Chapman, the man who'd later launch him to superstardom, and that was in a 10-lap GT race. And while having a pee before the race, Clark overheard Chapman and Mike Costin, who was also in an Elite, talking about flipping a coin to decide which of them would win the race. But actually it was Clark who was leading when a backmarker spun in front of him, allowing Chapman to snatch the win. It's a good point to dwell on just for a second, because people tend to think of Chapman only as one of the most iconic team bosses of the 1960s and 1970s in Formula One. And of course he was that. Absolutely he was that. But he was also a very, very good driver. Perhaps good enough to do well in Formula One, inside the cars as well as outside them, if he decided to go down that route. But anyway, Richard, do you think Chapman recognised Clark's talent straight away that Boxing Day at Brands Hatch in 1958?
Yes, although actually he'd already noticed him a couple of months earlier at an informal test session at Brands, when Jim did a few laps in the front-engined Lotus 16 single-seater, that very beautiful front-engine car that looked a bit like a miniature van wall. But Chapman definitely wrote Clark's name down for future reference after the Boxing Day meeting, and he underlined it when Jim carried on winning in 1959 with both the Elite and the Lister Jag.
With you watching?
With me watching, yep.
Yeah.
And in June of that year, 59, Clark went to Le Mans for the first time, teamed up with John Whitmore in an Elite entered by Border Reivers but supervised by Chapman. Whitmore was also a farmer from Essex, and to go back to that day at Mallory in 1959, the first thing I saw on arriving at the circuit were bits of pale blue fiberglass flying into the air. Whitmore and Clark, in their 2 Elites, had got tangled up during the morning practice session, and Whitmore came off worse. In fact, his car had to go home on a trailer. But, as he told me many years later, he'd already noticed Jim's talent. Quote, "He was a second or so quicker than me, and I thought, this chap's good," unquote. They became very good friends, to the extent that Clark was soon being invited to use Whitmore's Mayfair flat, just off Park Lane, as a regular pied-à-terre in London. And they'd have done very well together at Le Mans if they hadn't had trouble with the starter motor. It kept overheating, and they had to change it at every stop. So after spending a total of 2.5 hours in the pits, they were only able to finish 10th. But Chapman was impressed, nevertheless, and for 1960 he offered Jim a seat in his Formula Junior team, driving one of the new Lotus 18s, the first rear-engined Lotus, with a lightweight chassis suitable for Formula One as well as Formula 2 and Formula Junior. Imagine that today.
Extraordinary.
And Jim won his first 2 races in the car at Goodwood at Oulton Park, and he was on his way. To get him into his Formula One team, Chapman had to beat Aston Martin, who were in their second unsuccessful season in F1. Their team manager, the veteran Reg Parnell, had made Jim an offer which he was on the brink of accepting when Chapman came along and gazumped Aston. Jim had driven Aston's front-engine Grand Prix car, and he enjoyed it very much. It was a very powerful car. He liked that feeling. But when he tried the Lotus 18, he knew that he was being given a chance to step into the future.
Interesting car, that DBR4, wasn't it?
DBR4, yeah.
And because probably about 3 years too late. If
Yeah.
it had been in 55, it might have been as good as a 250F.
Exactly, which is what it looked like also.
Absolutely.
It was a lovely car. No, it would have been useful. It was just years too late.
Exactly.
Chapman and Clark became very close, and it would be the partnership that defined Clark's career and provided Chapman with the driver who could best exploit his brilliant and very innovative designs. And before Clark, he'd had Graham Hill, Cliff Allison, Alan Stacey, John Surtees and Innes Ireland, all of them seriously good, but none of them quite blessed with the genius that Chapman spotted in Jim. Something about Clark's touch at the wheel suited the delicacy of the Lotus single-seaters. He was quite small, only 5'7", and lightly built, and that helped. He could handle big and brutal cars, but giving him one of Chapman's Lotuses in the 60s was like handing Yehudi Menuhin a Stradivarius violin.
Yeah, that's a very nice analogy. And if I may say, you say that they became very close, Clark and Chapman, and they did. And according to some of the Lotus guys at the time, they were almost inseparable. I mean, for many years, and this is extraordinary, I think, now to modern ears, but for many years they used to share a twin room in the hotels they stayed in for Formula One Grand Prix. I mean, just imagine that. Just imagine Fred Vasseur and Lewis Hamilton sharing a twin room at the Monaco Grand Prix. Can you imagine that? Okay, it was a different era, and money was tighter in Formula One than it is now. But you'd still think that Chapman and Clark could stretch to a room each. But no, they often didn't. I think they liked to talk about racing together well into the night.
It's funny, in all sorts of sports, room sharing was common, like rugby teams go, on Lions.
Cricket, tours.
Football teams. They often, I guess, to save money, but also a bit of camaraderie.
Yes.
Someone actually once described Chapman as Clark's Svengali, and there's probably a bit of truth in that. Jim was still dealing with parental disapproval, but Colin persuaded him to devote all his energies to the sport and let someone else take care of the farm. When Clark's autobiography was published in 1964, which was soon after his first World Championship, Chapman provided a foreword, and here's what he wrote, quote, "The only trait of Scottish character which comes through with Jimmy is a certain dourness and a very strong determination to succeed. He's very intelligent, quick to learn, and he has a very good memory for things he wishes to remember. He only needs to be told something once, and he learns it," unquote. Bit of master and pupil there, then. And they were very different characters, a modest fellow from a rural background who found it very difficult to make decisions out of the cockpit, teamed with a sophisticated, risk-taking extrovert. Two geniuses in their contrasting ways, and you have to say how well the chemistry worked.
Yeah, Clark's inability to make decisions was legendary. When he went into a cafe, apparently, and ordered a breakfast, and the waiter or waitress asked him whether he wanted tea or coffee with it, he'd apparently reply, "Tea. No, coffee. No, maybe tea. Yes, tea. No, make that coffee." He used to drive his mates mad. And on his way from London to his home in Scotland, which journey he'd driven dozens of times, probably hundreds of times actually, there was apparently a fork in the road quite near his home in Scotland, with an orchard in the gap formed by the fork. On not one, not two, but 3 separate occasions he went straight on into the orchard because he couldn't remember or he couldn't decide if the correct route home was the left fork or the right fork. And on the second occasion, he was in a Porsche, driving very fast, therefore. And for that reason, he went off into the orchard at very high speed. He didn't injure himself, but the Porsche was a write-off.
Well, as a fan of Porsches of that era, that brings a tear to my eye.
Yes.
I must say. And it's a good job he didn't do that at Spa, isn't it? Really?
Well, exactly. Anyway, back to our story and Clark's progression. He beat John Surtees to the Formula Junior Championship in 1960.
And Surtees was very quick at that time. He'd only just started racing on 4 wheels.
But he was good at it already.
He really was, yeah.
And then Clark had a go at Formula 2. All of this is in Lotuses, of course. And then Chapman gave him his first Formula 1 outing in the 1960 Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort in a Lotus 18, the car you've described already. He qualified 11th and retired it with transmission trouble. Do you think he was ready for Formula One, though, Richard?
Well, it seems to me that Jim was always ready for whatever car he was put into in whatever environment, so yes. But his second Grand Prix, 2 weeks later, was such a harrowing experience that afterwards he almost gave up motor racing for good. It was in Belgium, at the daunting Spa-Francorchamps circuit, which in those days was 8 miles of sweeping public roads. He didn't actually like Spa anyway, because on his first visit there for a sports car race in 1958, the brilliant Archie Scott Brown had been killed in a Lister Jaguar. This time, for the Grand Prix 2 years later, Stirling Moss crashed heavily in practice and hurt himself when a drive shaft broke on his Lotus. Mike Taylor was taken to hospital when the steering column broke on his Lotus. Then the Cooper driver Chris Bristow was killed in a crash with Willie Mares's Ferrari during the race itself. And Alan Stacey, yet another ill-fated Lotus driver, was killed after he was hit in the face by a bird, which made him lose control and go off the track, and his car somersaulted into a field and caught fire. Bristow's accident struck Jim particularly hard. He was first on the scene of the crash, and when he got back to the pits after the race, his car was spattered with blood. So of the 5 Lotus drivers entered, 1 was dead, 2 were badly injured in hospital, a 4th, Innes Ireland, had been badly shaken up by a spin and a crash, and only Clark was left running in 5th place at the end. I was, he said, driving scared stiff pretty much all through the race.
Deary me, look, I think I should say at this point, one of the unfortunate aspects of our podcast, and Colossally, that's history, or Colossally for short, as we call it, is that we have to talk about death so much. But it's because racing was so very, very, very dangerous back in the day. Perhaps young Formula One fans have never, well, certainly young Formula One fans have never had to cope with the shock of watching, or even merely hearing about or reading about, as we did, Richard, one of their heroes being killed in action. And thank God for that. But in the 1960s and 1970s, it was not at all uncommon. And yes, as you say, in the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, not 1 but 2 drivers were killed. Chris Bristow on lap 20 and Alan Stacey on lap 25. Imagine that, just 1 and then 5 laps later, another. Bristow was decapitated and Stacey was burned to death. Just awful. Absolutely awful. Anyway, you say Clark almost gave up racing at that point, Richard. So what do you think made him carry on?
Well, here in his own words, here's how he explained it in his autobiography. When a thing like this happens, you vow that you'll never take part in a motor race again. You just want to get as far away from a car as possible. Then your mind begins to function again, and slowly everyday things start to crowd their way back. I don't think I'm callous, but I have somewhat been blessed by a bad memory for such things. A day later, you feel a little better. 3 days later, and you're packing your bags for another race. You keep telling yourself that you must overcome emotion, but at their height, your emotions can wield great power over your body and your mind. You can make rash decisions, and you have to live with them until you regain your self-control. You don't initially realize what everyone in such a predicament should realize. No matter how you feel, you still have to come back to reality and the living world.
It's quite a thoughtful couple of paragraphs, isn't it?
Extremely. I think he was a thoughtful guy. And he had an unusual temperament for a racing driver. He was a nail-biter. He worried a lot, obsessively. And he liked keeping himself to himself. He could be brusque, even rude, with outsiders. He detested newspaper journalists, for instance. He couldn't see the point of them, although he had a bit more time for the specialists from the motoring magazines.
So he'd have liked me better than you then, mate?
No. I was a fan before you.
You're the man from The Guardian. Anyway, he devoted page after page of his autobiography to the shortcomings of newspaper journalists, didn't he?
Yes, he did indeed, and why not? Outside the cockpit, he was terminally indecisive, as you say. I like the stories you told a few moments ago about the tea and the coffee and the fork in the road in Scotland. And here's what his pal Sir John Whitmore told me about him, remembering the times he put Jim up in his London flat. Quote, He was so difficult because I'd say, let's go out to eat. Which restaurant do you want to go to? And he'd always say, it's up to you. I'd say, shall we go to a movie? And he'd say, yes, but you choose. He'd never make a decision until he got into a racing car.
I'm surprised, as you said earlier, I'm surprised he remembered his way around the longer circuits, Nürburgring and the old Spa. But clearly he did, because he won there often enough, particularly Spa. Anyway, he did carry on racing after that absolutely awful baptism of fire at Spa in 1960, and he carried on racing extremely quickly too. So, in 1961, now in a Lotus 21 rather than a Lotus 18, his first full season of Formula One, he bagged his first podiums, finishing third at both Zandvoort and Reims. And in that year, another grim incident happened that would cast a long shadow over him when he was involved in one of the worst accidents in Formula One history, in the penultimate round of the 1961 Formula One World Championship at Monza.
Yeah, 1961 was the first season of the new 1.5-litre formula, which Ferrari dominated with their V6 engines, while the English teams struggled to keep up. Monza was the penultimate race of the season, and the world title was up for grabs between the two top Ferrari drivers, Wolfgang von Trips and Phil Hill. It was also, I remember very well, one of the few races broadcast live on the BBC, in black and white, of course. Ferrari had 5 cars entered, and Clark knew that his only chance in an underpowered 4-cylinder Lotus Climax was to get a good start and try to slipstream them around the circuit, which used the banked section that year and of course had no chicanes in those days to hinder slipstreaming. He got his good start, but 4 Ferraris had gone past him by the time he came towards the end of the second lap. The fourth of them was Von Trips. Jim kept up with him as they came down the back straight to the Parabolica, the last corner, and he intended to duck out of the slipstream and get past him again on the outside as they prepared to brake. But as he did, he found the Ferrari moving across towards him. Here, again from his autobiography, is how he described what happened next. Everything happened at lightning speed. We touched wheels, and oddly enough, I had a split second in which to think about the accident before it actually happened. I thought, God, he can't do this. I remember mentally trying to shout at him, to look in his mirror and see me. I had the brakes on hard by now, and I just couldn't do anything, for he was braking hard too. My wheels started to lock, and I left black marks, but I was too close to the edge of the circuit, and I couldn't go on the grass, because we were doing between 140 and 150 miles an hour at that time, and at that speed, you just can't go on the grass. As he came across, I just couldn't get out of the way. Taffy's car...
To be clear, in case anyone listening doesn't know, Wolfgang von Trips' nickname was Taffy.
Yeah, it was indeed. So back to Clark. Quote, Taffy's car shot off the road and into a fence, which the crowd were leaning on, before bouncing back onto the circuit, leaving the driver lying on the grass. I remember jumping out of my car and running over with a marshal and trying to drag Taffy's car back off the track, for there was a race still on. But even then, I realised there was nothing I could do for Taffy, and I didn't really want to go over to where he lay. Unquote. And 15 spectators were killed, along with Von Trips. And of course, this being 1961 and things being very different in those days, the race carried on to its conclusion, with Phil Hill winning the World Championship.
Extraordinary to modern ears.
Yep. Fingers were pointed and legal action was threatened. 15 spectators had been killed. But it wasn't until a year later that Clark returned to Italy and was called in during practice for the 1962 Grand Prix at Monza for a 3-hour interview with the police, during which he made a statement. And it was still rumbling on a year later. And after returning from Monza in 1963, he gave a press conference in London. This is what he said. As far as I can see, they're just out to try and pin the blame on someone, and I'm the handiest person around. My conscience is completely clear on the question of whether it was my fault. Not that I'm saying it was anyone else's fault. He pointed out that of the two drivers involved, he was the only one left to give evidence. And of course, in those days, there wasn't any telemetry data or TV footage from multiple angles to be examined. There was just one bit of grainy black and white TV film shot from a long way away and completely inconclusive, if you were looking for hard evidence. But I remember from watching on TV at home that day how shocking it was. And I remember feeling that it seemed quite untypical of Clark to get involved in an incident like that. He was already super quick, but always neat and tidy and scrupulously fair.
Yeah, he was. So do you think Monza 1961 made him question his decision to race on? I mean, again, a bit like Spa 1960.
No, I don't think so. He was sure it wasn't his fault. And as we heard before, he'd worked out how to deal with the consequences of a dangerous sport.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. So anyway, yes, again, he did race on. And less than a month later, he was on the grid at Watkins Glen in the United States for the final race of the 1961 season. A race in which Team Lotus would score its first Formula One Grand Prix victory, albeit not with Clark at the wheel. That honour went instead to Clark's countryman, fellow Scot Innes Ireland, who drove his Lotus 21 to victory ahead of local hero Dan Gurney's Porsche. Of course, to be clear, Stirling Moss had already won Formula One Grand Prix in Lotuses, but not Works Lotuses, not Team Lotus Lotuses, but instead for privateer Rob Walker's team.
Yep. And Clark said of Ireland's victory, "As a Scotsman and a teammate, I was naturally glad to see Innes Ireland win the American Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, and he was the first Scot ever to win a Grande Épreuve," unquote. But unfortunately, it became a bitter feud when Jim took over as the team's number one for 1962 and Innes was dropped. Innes was a hard guy. He was 5 years older than Jim. He'd done his national service as a paratrooper. And in terms of being the life and soul of the party, he was a very engaging social animal. He was excellent company at all times. And in that sense, he was everything Jim wasn't. But the news that there was no longer a place in the team for him was broken very undiplomatically by Chapman, and he never really got over it.
No, he didn't. Absolutely, Chapman nailed his colours to the mast there. Jim Clark was going to be Lotus's number one driver for 1962 and thereafter, and let's be honest, that would prove to be a fantastic decision by Chapman.
And that feels like a good time for our first break.
Richard, you started today's episode by sharing your fabulous story of seeing Jim Clark race for the first time when you were just 12. So I was wondering whether you'd like to open part 2 with your recollections of seeing Clark race for a second time, because I know you saw him on a number of occasions, actually. Something I never did, I wish I had, because I was only 5 years old when he died in April 1968.
Well, yeah, I saw Jimmy race again at Mallory on Whit Monday in 1962. That was a race called the International 2000 Guineas, a non-championship Formula One race in the days when there were lots of them to fill the gaps in the rather sparse Grand Prix calendar.
Yeah, and if I may interject briefly, that leads me to our first anorak fact of this Colossally episode.
Ba-bum, ba-bum.
Younger listeners may well not realise quite how many non-championship Formula One races there used to be back in the day. For example, in the year we're talking about, 1962, there were only 9 World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix, of which Clark won 3, but there were no fewer than 20 non-championship Formula One races, of which Clark won 5. Anorak fact.
Yeah, it was a good thing in a way because it gave a lot more people a chance to see Formula One races in a less pressurised environment.
It did.
Wish they still had them. Anyway, Jimmy took pole position at Mallory on Whit Monday in 1962 in a Lotus 25, beautiful little car with the new Climax V8 engine. 51 seconds for the 1.3-mile circuit. And there were just 2 other cars with the Climax V8, John Surtees' Lola and Jack Brabham's private Lotus. Sadly, for the crowd of around 40,000, the promised Works Ferrari didn't turn up. But then we'd only paid £1 a head to get in.
Just 20 tanners. No,
40 tan.
40 tan. Let's not go there.
No, okay. You're a decimal person, I think. And alas for fans like me, Clark retired with low oil pressure. Surtees won, giving the very pretty Lola what would be its only victory, with Brabham second and Graham Hill third in Rob Walker's four-cylinder Lotus.
Well, yeah, Clark might have missed out on that win that day at Mallory Park, but just 6 days later, he was victorious in a World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix, no less. At the same Spa circuit where he'd had such a difficult and, well, traumatising time in 1960, he won from 12th on the grid, taking the lead after 11 laps. And as we touched on earlier, Spa has always been a driving challenge. I mean, it still is now, but it was even more so in the 1960s. You know, the old 8.8 mile, 14.1 kilometre Spa, I mean. You needed courage and finesse in equal measure, which Clark had, and only the best of the best won there. And that win in 1962 was the first of 4 consecutive victories for Clark on, arguably, Formula One's most daunting circuit, Spa. Fantastic stuff, especially as he didn't even like the place, as you've said. But why do you think he was quite so good at Spa, Richard? In fact, and we're moving on to one of racing's big questions here, what do you think made him so quick as a driver in general?
Well, I think he always drove with great calmness and precision, which are certainly qualities that help on a super-fast road circuit like Spa, as long as you've got the basic speed, particularly in its old configuration, as you say. And while he was fast, he was also easy on his cars. He didn't overstress them, which is probably why he survived as long as he did driving Lotuses. He could put fear out of his mind, and he wasn't a show-off, which would help, although he could be spectacular, as he showed when he was driving Lotus Cortinas in saloon car races, usually cornering with one wheel off the ground and giving the crowds a thrill.
Brilliant footage to see now, isn't it?
It is, yeah. There are lots of opportunities to look at that. And he was also brilliant in the wet, and of course it often rains in the Belgian Ardennes. That Spa win was the first of the 3 you alluded to in 1962, not including his non-championship F1 race wins. The others were at Aintree in the British Grand Prix and Watkins Glen in the US round of the series. So he finished up second in the championship behind Graham Hill in his second full season. And Graham had 4 wins, so between them they won 7 out of the 9 rounds. Jim retired with mechanical problems in 4 of the 6 races he didn't win, and he'd started from pole position in each of those 4.
Yeah. When I asked you what you thought made Clark so quick as a driver, I honestly think you nailed it. The things you said about his calmness, his precision, his brilliance in the wet, and the way he nursed his cars instead of caning them. All that I think was spot on. But I'd also like to offer another view here, if I may, also super positive, of course, and including some observational insights as to how he conjured his speed, including not only a bit about his technique, but also a description of his indefatigable determination. And it's not from me, it comes from L.J.K. Setright, whom you probably remember, do you?
I certainly do,
Yeah.
I was an avid reader of Setright.
Of Setright, yes. Well, I was a colleague of his. I worked with him on Car Magazine in the early 1990s. He was the magazine's star writer, already a certain age then, and long dead now, 20 years dead now. And I was the young features editor. Anyway, this is what Setright wrote for Car Magazine after having attended the 1966 Monaco Grand Prix, obviously long before I was working for Car. And to listeners who've never read Setright before, I commend his elegant prose style to you. You'll see what I mean. Quote, "It was the first year of the 3-litre Formula One, but the best that Lotus could do for the world's greatest driver was an old Lotus 33 fitted with a 2-litre Climax V8, a nice engine in a beautiful car. But, pitted against a largely 3-litre field, could Clark honestly be seen as having the superior equipment that was so often supposed to account for his superior performance? Not a chance. But there he was, on pole position. When the flag fell, he shot away, intent as ever on establishing such a lead as would deter or dismay those compelled to follow him. Then, all of a sudden, he was going nowhere, and the field rushed past. His gearbox had stuck in bottom gear. Eventually, it freed, and he set off in pursuit. I was watching from the infield, standing at the very apex of the old gasworks hairpin. Monte Carlo streets are not the easiest on which to overtake, but Clark was doing it time and again. Quite often as he hove into my view, I found that I could actually hear the car's brakes being applied, and I noted that Clark was starting his braking at about the point where most of the others were finishing theirs. Progressively, he would ease his brakes on, all the way to the apex of the corner, at which point he would throw a pout of the lower lip as he switched his right foot from brake to accelerator and went hounding off after his next victim. How many he dismissed that way I cannot recall, but there was no question of anything unfair. His racing manners were always impeccable. After 60 of the scheduled 100 laps, he was up to third, at which juncture, just as he was approaching my corner, the Lotus's rear suspension broke, and it wobbled to the outer edge of the track, and retirement. Say not the struggle naught availeth. Clark could fight. How about that for a bit of race reporting, Richard?
Marvellous. Setright was a one-off, wasn't he?
He really was.
And I love that bit about the pout of the lower lip as
Brilliant.
he switched his right foot from the brake to the accelerator. I mean, imagine being able to see drivers' expressions.
Incredible.
Rather than just a pair of eyes through a cockpit cam.
Absolutely brilliant.
Anyway, 1962, incidentally, was also the year when Clark and Chapman left Le Mans, vowing never to return. They turned up with a beautiful little Lotus 23 sports car with a modified Ford Anglia engine. It looked so certain to win the Index of Performance, which was the class based on fuel consumption, and it was usually the class where the French manufacturers traditionally saved their faces. But the French scrutineers found a reason to exclude it before the race. They pointed out that the wheels were attached by 4 studs at the front and 6 at the back. The regulations said they had to be the same at both ends, so that the mandatory onboard spare wheel could be used on any of them. Well, that's fair enough. So Chapman got his mechanics to modify the rear fixings overnight to match the front, and represented it for scrutineering.
Yeah.
But then the commissaires said that the rear wheels had originally required 6 studs. If that was the case, then 4 must be less safe. So the disqualification stood.
Oh, for goodness sake.
Chapman and Clark thought they'd been stitched up, or whatever the French for stitching up is. They stormed out and never went back.
Well, they probably had been stitched up, truth be told, hadn't they? Anyway, if 1962 was a good season for Clark and Lotus, then 1963 was an incredible one. Arguably one of the greatest seasons for a driver and a team in the history of motor racing, all motor racing. Would you agree, Richard?
Yes, I would, yeah.
Yeah,
Phenomenal.
I mean, look, just listen to the stats. Of the 10 World Championship status Grand Prix that year, Formula One Grand Prix that year, Clark won 7. He was on the podium in 2 of the other 3, and he finished outside the points only once, 8th at Monaco. He was on the pole for 7 of those 10 races, and he clocked the fastest lap in 6 of them. That little lot obviously earned him his first Formula One Drivers' World Championship and Lotus their first Formula One Constructors' World Championship, both by a big margin. But to back all that up, Clark finished second in the Indy 500 for Lotus, of course, and he actually won another USAC race, also for Lotus, the Tony Bettenhausen 200 at the Milwaukee Mile, also from the pole. And he won 5 non-championship Formula One races too. Just incredible.
Yep. And 1963 was actually a special year in lots of respects. It was the year of Beatlemania and the Great Train Robbery, and the year of the Profumo scandal. In the words of the poet Philip Larkin, it was also the year sexual intercourse began.
Really, was it?
Well, not so sure about that. But it was certainly the start of the 60s as we think of them now. And with Jimmy Clark's success, it was like the 60s had come to motor racing too. And there were some incredible performances. At Spa, in the rain, he won from 8th place on the grid, having to hold the gear lever because it was trying to jump out of 5th gear. That was top gear in those days, and he needed it at Spa, of course. At Zandvoort, he lapped every other car. At the Nürburgring, he stalled his engine on the grid, passed 17 cars on the first lap, and finished second to Graham Hill with his engine on 7 cylinders. And then there was the first trip to Indianapolis with Chapman and the Ford-engined Lotus 29 to have a first crack at the 500. The local racing establishment, who was still stuck in the era of the glorious but antiquated front-engine roadsters, treated them as a joke, this little funny car with its rear engine. But they weren't laughing when Jim was in second place with 20 laps to go, only 5 seconds off the lead. And when that leading car, Parnelli Jones's Watson Offenhauser,
Offie, we like to call
if
it,
you
do
like,
we not?
yeah, Watson Offie, okay. Well, it's whatever we call it. It started dropping oil. And the rules on that were clear. He had to be black flagged. But Parnelli Jones was Indy royalty, as was the car's entrant, a man called J.C. Agajanian, who happened to be on the board of the US Auto Club. So the black flag wasn't raised, despite Chapman's entreaties to the stewards. Several cars spun on the dropped oil and crashed into the wall in those closing laps, but Jones won and Clark finished second, 30 seconds behind, having backed off in expectation of the leading car's disqualification. It was a fix, but it was also a lesson well learned, and it gave them fuel for revenge.
Another stitch-up, just like Le Mans, really.
Exactly.
Anyway, by 1964, Clark was seen by every other racing driver in the world, I think, as primus inter pares, first among equals. They just knew he was better than they were. Some of them admitted it, but I think they all knew it. He didn't win the Formula One Drivers' World Championship in 1964, but really he should have done. He was on the pole for 5 of the 10 Grand Prix that took place that year. He clocked fastest lap for 4 of them, but he won only 3, Zandvoort, Spa and Brands Hatch. But even so, that was still more than anyone else. John Surtees won the Drivers' World Championship for Ferrari with 2 Grand Prix wins, and Clark led and could have won 4 more Grand Prix that he didn't end up winning that year. Monaco, Rouen, Watkins Glen and Mexico City. You know, Lotuses were never very reliable, and as I say, with better reliability, Clark would have become 1964 world champion quite comfortably. But he made up for it in 1965, another annus mirabilis in which he became the only driver in history to win the Formula One Drivers' World Championship, with 6 wins out of the 10 Grand Prix that year, plus 6 poles and 6 fastest laps, and the Indy 500 in the same season, despite missing Monaco to do Indy. This time the stateside racing establishment couldn't stop him.
Yeah, and it actually got him the cover of Time magazine, which was a coveted honour in those days, usually reserved for presidents and military heroes. Although a couple of months before Jim, there'd been a cover headlined, "Rock and Roll is Here to Stay," with photos of the Beach Boys, the Supremes, and Petula Clark and Herman's Hermits.
Really?
The line on Jim's cover was, "Jim Clark, the fastest man on wheels."
Which he was.
Yep. I saw one of his 6 Grand Prix victories that season at Silverstone. He was in the Lotus 33 with the V8 Climax engine, pretty much one of those perfect Grand Prix cars, like the McLaren MP4 of 1988 or the Red Bull RB6 of 2010. He didn't have it quite his own way at Silverstone, in the sense that although he started from pole, he wasn't actually the first into Copse Corner, which was what you would now call Turn 1.
Turn 1.
That's where I was standing, and it's still where I always stand at Silverstone, even though it's no longer Turn 1. And it was quite a shock to see Richie Ginther's V12 Honda leading into the right-hander. That was the first time a Japanese car had led a Grand Prix.
Anorak fact, please.
Yeah, I don't come up with many of those, but I will
one.
I will claim that one. But it didn't last. Clark went past Ginther on Hanger Straight on that first lap, And if you just looked at the complete lap chart of the race afterwards, it was all over from then on. He led every lap. But it wasn't actually that simple. There was still drama. Just after half distance, Clark was cruising half a lap ahead of Graham Hill's BRM when his oil pressure was falling. In the closing laps, he only managed to preserve his engine and stay ahead of Hill by switching it off in the corners, coasting silently, then switching it back on. That was weird to watch, I can tell you. You know, the leading car just going silently through the corner. Then
you were aware of it from trackside,
but you didn't know why. You know,
yeah.
because nobody was telling you anything.
No.
And the lead was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and in the end, Jim won by just 3 seconds. Actually, Dennis Jenkinson of Motorsport thought it was an example of the other drivers being psyched out by Clark's usual dominance. Here's what he wrote, quote, "Graham Hill worked up to a grand finale of setting a new lap record on the last lap, but it would have been more impressive if he'd done that more times and earlier in the race," unquote.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's a bit like what I was saying earlier about the other drivers just knowing that Clark was better than them.
Yep.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Anyway, slight cul-de-sac here. There's a bizarre story from a bit earlier in that season about the Lotus team meeting Yuri Gagarin, the first Soviet cosmonaut, at a civic party in Clermont-Ferrand the night before the French Grand Prix. A lot of champagne was drunk, apparently. Then finally Chapman drove Clark's girlfriend Sally Stokes, and Mike Spence, the Lotus No. 2 driver, back to their hotel. But they didn't make it because somehow Chapman put their Peugeot hire car into a ditch. One day there's probably a podcast about Formula One and hire cars. Anyway, Chapman cut his thumb. Not too bad. Spence was unhurt. But Sally Stokes went through the windscreen and had cuts to her head and face, poor woman. Clark took one look at her and fainted. Somehow, although Sally had to be stitched up at the local hospital, they managed to keep it all quiet. What happened the next day? Clark won. He won the French Grand Prix from the pole with fastest lap, and he led every lap too. So it was a Grand Slam, or as I prefer to call it, Grand Chelem, because we don't say Grand Prize, we say Grand Prix, don't we? The most dominant way a driver can possibly win a race. And that brings me to another anorak fact. You'll have to bring your trumpet next time.
Well.
Anyway, although he started only 72 World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix and finished far fewer, owing to Lotus's legendary unreliability mainly, he scored 8 Grand Chelems in his Formula One career. That's the record still now. Next up is a man you may have heard of, dear listeners, Lewis Hamilton, with 6. And I think that's yet another statistic that absolutely underlines Clark's brilliance.
Yes, indeed, Matt. But your mention of Sally Stokes brings up another aspect of his legendary indecisiveness outside the cockpit, and that's the toll it took on his private life. He liked women, he liked them very much, and they were always throwing themselves at him, and often he took advantage of the opportunities. But Sally Stokes was a bit different. She lasted quite a long time. She was a model, a bit of a Jean Shrimpton look-alike, if you're old enough to know what that means.
Well, I think I am at 62, old enough to know what that means. And didn't Clark pose with Jean Shrimpton for a magazine ad for the Ford Corsair?
Yeah, he did, and a very handsome couple they made. They were actually photographed by the great David Bailey, Shrimpton's ex-boyfriend. Anyway, Sally Stokes was with Jim for several seasons. She'd actually set eyes on him for the first time at the same Mallory Park meeting that I went to in 1959, but it was a while before they went on a date, and that was actually set up by her friends John Whitmore and his wife. They went to the London premiere of Cleopatra, starring Liz Taylor and Richard Burton. That's how long ago it was. And all their friends assumed they'd get married, as did Sally. It was a bit like Paul McCartney and Jane Asher. If they'd made it down the aisle, the whole world would have cheered and breathed a sigh of relief. But Jim kept avoiding the issue, wouldn't make a decision. And eventually she gave him an ultimatum, at which point he suggested that she'd be better off getting married to someone else. So she did. She married Ed Swart, a Dutch driver who raced sports and touring cars, mostly Abarths. and eventually they went off to live in California, from where she stayed in touch with the Clark family and never had a bad word to say about her former boyfriend.
That's interesting. Anyway, let's move on to 1966 now, if we can. The first season of the 3-litre Formula One. The first Grand Prix was Monaco, and that's the race about which LJK Setright wrote that wonderful report that I read out a few minutes ago. And the reason why Lotus had saddled Clark with a 2-litre engine in a 3-litre formula, which seems idiotic, right, was that they'd been planning on running the BRM H16 engine, but it wasn't ready early enough, and when it was awfully heavy. Actually, quite a few of the teams were struggling with engines that year. For example, Cooper used a Maserati V12 that Maserati had run as long ago as 1957. OK, it had been updated a bit, but it was still almost 10 years old. McLaren were in trouble with engines too, flitting to and fro from a Ford V8 to a Serenissima V8.
Whatever that was.
Exactly. Well, it sounds nice. The team that made the best fist of it, engine-wise, was Brabham, who used a 3-litre Repco V8, and so it was that Jack Brabham became world champion, the first and now surely the only man to win a Formula One World Championship driving a car bearing his own name. Clark won just one race at Watkins Glen in a Lotus powered by that BRM H16 engine, which makes it the only World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix win for a car with 16 cylinders. Anyway, in 1967, Lotus's engine troubles were well and truly solved by the arrival of the legendary 3-litre Ford Cosworth DFV V8. DFV standing for double 4-valve, of course, meaning 4 valves per cylinder across 2 banks of cylinders.
Well, I saw Clark lead the Belgian Grand Prix in that car's second race.
That car being the famous Lotus 49.
Yes, indeed. It was a lovely sunny day, and I was sitting on the grass near the top of the rise above Eau Rouge, looking across to the old starting grid, which was on the downhill section, down from La Source. Jim started from pole, and of course I was hoping to see him win at Spa for a 5th time. But a long stop to cure ignition trouble meant that he finished 6th, a lap down. The race was actually won by the beautiful Eagle Westlake V12 of Dan Gurney.
Can I just say quickly, Ron Dennis, my old boss at McLaren, thought that car is the most beautiful racing car of all time.
Well, he's not far off.
He's not far off, is he?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
It's often said that Gurney was the only driver that Clark actually feared in terms of speed, which may have been true. Jim would take 4 wins that season, including the last 2 of the year at Watkins Glen and Mexico City, which showed what might have been if the car had been reliable straight away. But that was only good enough for 3rd in the championship, behind the more consistent Brabhams of Denny Hulme and Jack Brabham himself. They had only 2 wins apiece, but lots more points finishes. But what Jim's fans remember from that year is what he did at Monza. He led the Italian Grand Prix for 12 laps, then picked up a puncture and lost a whole lap getting the wheel changed. And he spent the next 48 laps overtaking the entire field, going past 15 cars, one after another, to get the lead back. And he was about to win when he started to run out of fuel on the very last lap, because he'd been charging so hard, I think. And he was overtaken by Surtees and Brabham. It was a 3rd place, almost as fondly remembered as the greatest of his wins.
Yes, absolutely. That 3rd place for Clark at Monza in 1967 is one of the all-time great Formula One drives, no question about it. Anyway, on to 1968. The season started with the South African Grand Prix, and here, if I may, is another Anorak fact. The race was run on January the 1st, New Year's Day, which meant that qualifying was run on December the 31st. Yes, qualifying and race took place not only in different months, but actually in different years.
A bonus Anorak point for that one, Matt.
Anyway, not surprisingly, Clark took the pole. His pole lap a whole second faster than the best that his Lotus teammate Graham Hill could manage. Then, the next day, Clark drove the fastest lap, and he won the race easily. The next round of the Formula One World Championship would be the Spanish Grand Prix on May the 12th, more than 4 months later.
And that feels like a good time for our final break.
For motor racing fans of a certain age, the date April the 7th, 1968 is burned into the subconscious, just as May the 1st, 1994 is burned into the subconscious of slightly younger motor racing fans. Richard, do you remember where you were when you heard the news that the great Jim Clark had been killed in a Formula 2 race at Hockenheim on April the 7th, 1968?
Well, quite honestly, Matt, I don't. It was a Sunday, so I think I was probably at home. But what I do remember very clearly indeed was the sense of not just shock, but utter dismay. And it was all the greater because he was the one you never expected it to happen to. He was at a level above everybody else, and that made him seem invulnerable. That was an illusion, of course. And a bit like Senna a quarter of a century later, I guess. Another of those days when following motor racing ceases to feel like an innocent pleasure.
Yeah, that's well put, I think. Anyway, that Formula 2 race at Hockenheim wasn't an important event, but in those days, Formula 1 drivers used to race almost anything in their free weekends between Grand Prix. A number of Formula 1 drivers took part in that Hockenheim Formula 2 race, therefore. Not only Clark, but also Graham Hill, John Surtees, Chris Amon, Jean-Pierre Beltoise, Piers Courage, etc. Oh, and Max Mosley, too, the future FIA president, not that he was ever a Formula 1 driver. And here, if you'll indulge me, is a truly remarkable story, I think, because just over 30 years later, on August the 2nd, 1998, to be precise, which was the date on which that year's German Grand Prix was being run, also at Hockenheim, an hour before the warm-up. Do you remember race morning warm-ups, Richard?
Certainly do. What a good thing they were.
They were. Anyway, an hour before the warm-up, I walked from the paddock to a spot near the first chicane to pay my respects to the memorial monument to Clark that had been placed there, a small stone cross near where he breathed his last. Anyway, when I got there, I saw something that I really didn't want to see. Sitting on the cross itself, were two bleary-eyed, beer-gutted and scarlet-clad oafs. Sorry, but they were oafs. Each wearing a Decra-branded cap. Do you remember them?
Yep.
Each sipping a can of Warsteiner beer. Schumi fans, obviously. All around were crisp packets, cigarette butts, Warsteiner empties, and more dozing drunks. And I was incensed, and I summoned up my courage to say, "Get off that." At first there was no reaction. "Get off that," I shouted again. Eventually they complied, mumbling and chuckling. I tried to pay my respects as I'd planned, but it was hopeless. The drunks were too close by, and they were still mumbling and still chuckling. Soon I gave up and walked, the 50-odd metres to the first chicane itself, the Jim Clark curve, as it was called, which is where I'd been planning to watch the warm-up from. On my way, I passed a marshal's post and some marshals. "Scottish?" one of them asked me. I was a bit surprised. "No, English, British," I replied. And then he replied, "British, like Jimmy. I saw you at the cross." Then, after a pause, he added, "I saw him die." And there and then I decided to interview this 60-something marshal for F1 Racing, the magazine I was editing at the time. So I asked Darren Heath, our photographer, who was standing nearby, to take a portrait pic of him, which he did. His name, I remember it, was Winfried Kolb. Grey-haired, chubby, and he told me that he'd stood at Marshal Post number 16 on most race days since 1965. I won't read the entirety of the interview I did with him and which I published in F1 Racing because it's too long for a podcast, but here are some of the things I wrote about what he said. So these are all quotes from the Marshal. Quote, "I remember April the 7th, 1968 so well. I was a big Jimmy Clark fan. Me and my friends were so excited that he was coming to Hockenheim for the Formula 2 race. In our opinion, he was the greatest. There was no chicane here in those days, just one long curved road, a tunnel carved through the forest. with trees each side no more than a metre from the trackside. We were disappointed that Jimmy wasn't on the pole. He was a few rows back. Car trouble, perhaps tyre trouble, we heard. But he was here, at Hockenheim, at our track, which had never staged a Formula One Grand Prix in those days. At the start, it had stopped raining, but there were still puddles everywhere. I remember that Kurt Achrens was leading, from Henri Pescarolo and Jean-Pierre Beltoise. Visibility was terrible. Spray everywhere. They passed my post at maximum speed, which for a late 1960s Formula 2 car was about 250 kilometres per hour, or about 155 miles per hour. To my surprise and disappointment, Jimmy wasn't moving up. Then, as the cars came by for another lap, I looked to my right, and I saw the nose of Achrens' Brabham, the nose of Pescarolo's Matra, the nose of Beltoise's Matra, and then the number 1 on the side of Jimmy's Lotus. It all happened so quickly. The back end of the car snapped to the left. Jimmy's hand went up to correct. The car slid broadside towards the side of the track, the left side, where my post was. There was a lot of spray, but I could see that the Lotus was heading for a tree. One big tree among all the other trees. And I could see that there was no way Jimmy was going to be able to avoid it. The car hit the tree, side on, and it broke into 3 pieces. The engine and gearbox flew about 80 metres along the low wall that spectators could stand behind there. The front part disintegrated and slid down the tarmac, and the cockpit part, with Jimmy still inside, ended up on the left-hand side of the track. Jimmy's head was still on one side. I was frozen. It looked so bad. In those days you didn't have doctors at every post like you do now, so I had to radio for one to come. All the cars had sped past. The track was empty. Everything was quiet. I ran to Jimmy. It took me about a minute to get to him, and the doctor arrived by car a few seconds after me. There was no movement in the cockpit. I looked at the doctor, and his face was grim. He was bending over Jimmy. Suddenly he said, "He isn't dead." I remember that moment so clearly. I looked down the track, waiting for the ambulance, and then I saw it coming. I didn't dare to hope. They put Jimmy in the ambulance, and it drove away. No way was the accident Jimmy's fault. No way. That part of the track wasn't difficult. Flat out, but easy. I'm sure it was a blown tyre. The left rear, I think. I waited for news, and soon it came. Jimmy was dead. The field flew by again, now Beltoise ahead, and they all rushed past the debris in a ball of spray. Well, all except Graham Hill, Jimmy's Lotus teammate, who was running near the back. He looked in his mirrors, he went down through the gears, he slowed to walking pace, he stared at the debris, and he shook his head. I could see the shock on his face. Then he accelerated slowly away.
Well, that's fascinating. What a graphic description of those.
I felt so privileged to bump into him in that way.
Yeah, I'm sure you did, and it's quite a thing to have recorded for posterity.
Yes, and I was so lucky also that he spoke such good English.
Yep.
You know, a man 30 years ago, a German in his 60s, you might not necessarily be that lucky. Anyway, remarkable story.
I think a lot of people immediately assume that the accident had been caused by something breaking, and probably the rear suspension, which wasn't exactly unknown with Lotuses. But it really does seem to have been caused by a deflating tyre.
Yeah, which is what the marshal thought. Yep. Anyway, as I say, that interview was published in F1 Racing, a magazine I was then editor of, and Bernie Ecclestone read it, and his PA faxed it to the Hockenheim organisers, attaching a complaint from Bernie about the spectators' behaviour, which I'd described in my piece. And soon after, I received a letter of apology, which I still have actually, from the Hockenheim organisers, saying that they would put measures in place to prevent fans disrespecting Jim Clark's cross in future, which I think they did.
Good. And among the other competitors that day, as you said, Matt, was none other than Max Mosley in his first international F2 race, driving a Brabham he'd bought from Frank Williams. In his autobiography, he wrote not just about the horrible conditions that day, but about the impact of the tragedy and how it made it impossible for him to pretend to his wife that motor racing was basically a safe sport. When she asked him, if Jim Clark can get killed, why not you? He really didn't have an answer.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of what Howden Ganley once said to me many years later over lunch at the McLaren Technology Centre when I was working for McLaren as the team's comms and PR chief. In the 1960s, Howden had been racing in his native New Zealand, and by the time he'd come to Europe and he'd worked his way up to Formula One in 1971, that was, Clark had obviously been dead for 3 years. But the grief about Clark was still fresh for everyone in racing, and Clark was still a legend. Anyway, over post-lunch coffees, many years later, as I say, I remember asking Howden to think back to his Formula One career and to whether he'd feared for his life at the time. Because, of course, the early 1970s were a time when Formula One was extremely dangerous. And this is how he answered me, quote, "Oh, well, you have to realise that I didn't expect to survive my Formula One career. I was an okay driver, but if Jim Clark could die at the wheel of a Formula One car when he was a total genius, well, what chance did I have?"
Yeah, the place the news really made a particularly powerful impact on the day was Brands Hatch, where the BOAC 500, a big sports car race, was being held. Jim might have been there, not at Hockenheim, because Ford wanted him to drive their new prototype car, the F3L. But he told them that Colin Chapman wanted him and Graham Hill to do the F2 race at Hockenheim, and Lotus was always his priority. Chapman was probably also thinking that they had a new sponsor, Gold Leaf Cigarettes, in whose red and white colours the cars were now painted, and who had to be kept happy. But everybody who was at Brands that day remembers the awful sensation as the news went round. Eric Dimmock, who was the Guardian's motor racing correspondent at the time, wrote a biography of Clark, a very good one, and this is how he described the mood in the Brands Hatch press box. A sensation of incredulity, of incalculable grief, descending like a pall. Jim Clark had died of a broken neck. Motor racing almost died of a broken heart.
That's very well put, isn't it?
Yep, he was good, Dimmock. Matt, Jim was just 32 when he died, and he showed no signs of wanting to give up. How many more titles do you think he might have won had he survived?
Well, quite a few more, probably, but obviously we'll never know. And you could ask the same question about Ayrton Senna, who incidentally rated Clark as the very greatest. But isn't it strange to think that if Clark had raced on in Formula One to the age of, 40, and why shouldn't he have, he would have been racing against the next generation. You know, drivers like Emerson Fittipaldi, Ronnie Peterson, Niki Lauda, James Hunt, Mario Andretti, Carlos Reutemann, Jody Scheckter, etc.
And how do you think Colin Chapman was affected by losing his great champion?
Well, Chapman went missing for a while, didn't he? For example, he didn't even attend the next Grand Prix, the Spanish Grand Prix, which, by the way, Graham Hill won for Lotus, a very plucky performance indeed, and eerily but impressively similar to his son Damon's equally plucky Spanish Grand Prix win for Williams shortly after Senna had been killed at Imola in 1994. But anyway, Richard, what do you think Clark might have done in retirement?
Well, would he have gone back to farming? That's the big question. His father had passed the Eddington Mains farm on to him, and he'd certainly have continued to be its custodian, but I think he'd have got somebody else to run it for him and stayed in motor racing in some capacity.
Perhaps Peter Windsor.
Yeah, exactly.
Might have ended up as a farmer, yes.
Custodian farmer. Clark had become a lot more cosmopolitan in those last years, more outgoing and sociable. Some of that reserve was breaking down, even though his last few years were somewhat darkened by a long battle with the British tax authorities. In those days, high earners were expected to pay 90% of their income in tax, which Jim didn't see as reasonable. Big money was coming into the sport by that time. You know, for winning the Indy 500 in 1965, he took home a total of £46,000, which was the equivalent of over £1 million today. And he wanted to hang on to as much of it as he could. So in 1966, he went into tax exile, first in Paris, where he shared a flat with his friend and our friend, the late Jabby Crombach, the editor of the magazine Sport Auto. And then in Bermuda, where he bought a condominium. And to persuade the Inland Revenue that he really did live abroad, he had to remove all his possessions from the farm. Everything. I think that was a pretty hard task.
Yeah, I bet.
Nice thing to had to do. But let's talk about his legacy as a racer. Matt, where do you think he stands ultimately among the all-time greats?
Well, unlike you, I never saw Jim Clark race at all. I was 5 years old when he died. But if asked to name the greatest Formula One driver of them all, his is the name I answer with, if I have to answer with one. I think his stats are extraordinary, and his loyalty to Lotus, of course. But let's look at the stats. He made 72 Formula One Grand Prix starts. So many of them were DNFs, did not finish. And so few of those did not finishes, DNFs, were his fault. But despite all those DNFs, he scored 25 Grand Prix wins and 16 non-championship Formula One race wins too. But in addition to that, he also won 11 Formula Junior races, 13 Formula 2 races, the 1961 Springbok Series, 21 Tasman Series races, including the 1965, 1967 and 1968 Tasman Championships, 23 saloon car races, 54 sports car races, and 2 USAC races, one of them the Indianapolis 500. And as I mentioned earlier, what about his 8 Formula One Grand Chelem wins, pole, fastest lap, leading from lights to flag, which is still more than anyone else after all these years? But of all the stats, this is my favourite Jim Clark stat of them all. Guess how many times he finished second in Formula One Grand Prix? The answer is once. Just once. In other words, when his Lotuses held together, he won.
Yeah, you say you think he was the greatest, and on a purely emotional level, I'd agree, because I saw him when I was 12, and that's the impact he had on me. But there's also the pretty much unanimous acclaim of Clark's peers to back it up. They all believed him to be the best. And there's also the fact that he could win in anything, as you've said, including sports cars and saloons. Of course, your Max Verstappens and Lando Norrises don't get the chance to show whether they'd be capable of that. Although I'm pretty sure they would, actually.
So am I, to be fair.
Yeah. And that's really the answer to anyone who says, well, he only won Grand Prix with Lotus. I can see their point, and I happen to have a particular respect for drivers who win the World Championship with more than one team and more than one car designer. But I think the way Clark won his races puts him above that argument. Do you think he has a modern equivalent, Matt?
Probably not. OK, I agree with you that drivers like Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton too are absolutely top draw. Of course they are. Just as Juan Manuel Fangio and Sterling Moss were absolutely top draw before Clark's time. But, you know, time passes. Clark's reputation probably isn't now as high, generally, as it deserves to be. But perhaps, via this podcast, we've done our bit to explain to younger listeners just how magnificent he was.
Yes, he was, but time passes, as you say, and perhaps not everyone is as interested in history as we are. Do spectators at today's Grand Prix know about Tazio Nuvolari, Rudy Caracciola, and Alberto Ascari, or even Fangio? Do they need to, actually? But those drivers are all immortal, aren't they? And
they are.
So is Jim.
They are.
And, you know, although he was well aware of his own special qualities, he was brought up to be a modest person, and that's how he stayed. A few years ago, I visited his grave at the churchyard in Churnside, near the family farm, and I couldn't help but be impressed and moved by the inscription. Here's what it says. In loving memory of Jim Clark, OBE, farmer, Eddington, Maine, Churnside, and of Pembroke, Bermuda. world champion motor racing driver 1963 and 1965, winner of 25 Grand Prix races, Indianapolis 500 winner 1965, first freeman of the borough of Duns. Farmer first, then world champion motor racing driver. I think we can all respect that, even if it's not quite how we saw it.
Indeed we can. Absolutely we can. And that feels like a good place to say, and colossally, that's history, and wrap up our episode on the great Jim Clark, one of motorsport's immortals.
So let's get into our questions section now, where we answer a couple of questions about last week's topic, which happened to be Williams's 1986 season, when Frank Williams suffered his devastating road car accident, but survived to see his team win the Constructors' Championship. I should say, don't worry if we don't get to your question in this episode. There's still a chance we'll answer it in our end-of-season question and answer episode, which will be available exclusively for the Race Members Club. But more on that in a moment.
Yes, so let's get into it. And the first question comes from Michael Sanderson. He asks, were there any vultures waiting in the wings to buy the Williams team in the event that it couldn't continue under Frank Williams and Patrick Head's ownership?
Well, I have to say, I don't remember any talk of that at the time,
nor do
in the aftermath of Frank's accident. I mean, their partnership at that time was so solid. And, you know, I think to have entertained the idea of selling part of the team would have been to entertain the suggestion that Frank wasn't going to recover and wasn't going to be taking a further part in the team. I mean, 15 years later, you know, they had a partnership with BMW who wanted to buy the team then, and they refused that at the time. And it took a while after that before the team began to pass into other hands. But in the 80s, no, I don't think there was any.
Nor do I. I agree with you. But I also think that perhaps Mr. Sanderson's question implied that would that have been the case if Frank had sadly succumbed? And if that is what he also implies in his question, my answer to that is, well, Patrick Head was the co-owner. I think he had 30% and Frank had 70%.
Yeah.
But he still had 30%. And look, Patrick was no one's fool. Patrick would have stoutly defended and continued running the team in the way that he and Frank always had. So actually, I don't think there were vultures, or at least if there were vultures, they didn't have an earthly.
No, and I think Patrick, had that happened, Patrick would have continued with the full support of Ginny Williams, Frank's wife, and her 70%. Anyway.
Absolutely.
Our second question today is from Tim. And Tim says, how do you think the Mansell-Piquet rivalry would be played out today? In those days, did drivers have entourages and their teams of people like today? Would the Verstappen versus Sainz camps of Red Bull in 2015 be close to what you'd expect Mansell-Piquet to be like today? Or was it actually more toxic and we just didn't hear as much about it?
Well, in my view, we're talking about the 80s, aren't we? And although that is 40 years ago, yes, they did have entourages by that time. If you went back to the 50s, perhaps they didn't, but they did in the 80s. And the question includes the word toxic. Was it actually more toxic? No, nothing is more toxic than Nelson Piquet.
Care to expand on that?
I think I have in the past. By the way, okay, if somebody asks why I have said that, I mean, he was a great driver. He won 3 world championships, but he was appallingly rude about Roseanne Mansell, Nigel's wife.
Who was Mansell's entourage.
Absolutely, and with a couple of others, but yes. And he was appallingly rude about Ayrton Senna, and he was appallingly, more recently, rude about Lewis Hamilton.
Yep.
If you'd like to ask a question about Jim Clark, just head to patreon.com/therace and sign up to the Race Members Club. It costs about the same as a cup of coffee each month, and you'll get all the Racers' shows, including ours, ad-free, plus bonus shows and loads of other benefits.
And if you don't have a question for the show, but you'd still like to drop us a line, you can get in touch via podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop us a line via social media. I'm at the BishF1 and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
So that's it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our producer, Johnny Reynolds, and to you for listening, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And Colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.